Well, welcome to the Imaginary Conflict Show. My name is Rich, and in this video, we're going to be talking about the sad story of Fantasy Warlord, the challenger to Games Workshop that never really was. And where to begin? I suppose we'll start by talking about the two men that started the Fantasy Warlord game. So let's see, let's get that in focus. That would be one, Gary Chalk and Ian Bailey. So these chaps used to work for Games Workshop. Gary Chalk was a illustrator for Games Workshop, and Ian Bailey was actually once the financial director. So when they left the Games Workshop company a little before 1990, they both felt that Games Workshop had strayed away from the spirit of wargaming to pursuing a more sales-based commercial model. Makes you wonder what they think of Games Workshop now. But so Chalk and Bailey decided to try and rival their former employer. And they really went in for it. So they formed a new business called Folio Works, and they released two major products. The first was a magazine to try and rival White Dwarf, and they made absolutely no bones about the fact that that is exactly what they were doing, to the point where they actually named the magazine Red Giant, another star-based name. So it was very clear whose sights they had set. And the second product was Fantasy Warlord, which was a mass combat fantasy rule set. And it was made to rival Warhammer Fantasy Battles 3rd edition. And I will note this before we begin. Warhammer Fantasy Battles 3rd edition is now considered to be one of the more complicated and difficult to follow, and some would say least enjoyable of the rule sets. And that's important to note when talking about the trajectory of Fantasy Warlord. But how did Fantasy Warlord play? Let's look through the book, shall we? So, we're going to bring things up here. I'll just quickly flip to the contents page. There we go. So it's quite comprehensive, as you can see. I'm just going to list off the bits that we have here. So we'll start at chapter 4, which is Into Battle, which covers deployment, scouting, and the sequence of action. Then you have a section on orders, movement, battlefield terrain, missile fire, combat, morale, magic, and then tactical hints and terrain generation. So the thing to note about Fantasy Warlord was that it was very comprehensive, and it had a few things that in the 1990s were quite revolutionary, but these days quite often we take them for granted. So, for example, you would have a form of the alternate activation mechanics that we take for granted these days in most non-Games Workshop games. But the way that they did it was that you would have a form of simultaneous giving of orders. So what would actually happen would be that you would place down your order chits next to your unit at the exact same time as your opponent. And the idea wasn't that you were reacting to your opponent so much as you were trying to guess what your opponent was going to do. It was an idea by Chalk and Bailey that the spirit of wargaming really was supposed to be a lot more comprehensive, to a certain extent more rules dense, but ultimately to be more of a simulation of warfare with fantasy aesthetics than it was to be I suppose, a dedicated fantasy wargame. And yeah, so it was by all accounts a very comprehensive rule set, but why is it then, if they created this challenger that was supposed to do so well, that Games Workshop is still the undisputed champion of the wargames industry? And why is the company Folio Works a company that you've probably never heard of until this video? Well, Chalk and Bailey made a chronic misjudgment of the wargames community. And bear in mind, this is the wargames community of the 1990s, not the wargames community of today. So this was really before the internet had really taken off as a way for wargames to connect and exchange ideas. This was before a lot of the rules writers that used to be part of Games Workshop left and started their own enterprises. So thinking like Warlord games or Mantic games. Far from not liking Games Workshop's direction, the public actually lapped it up. The Wargames community of 1990 loved what Games Workshop were doing, especially with Warhammer Fantasy Battle and then Rogue Trader, which released, I believe, in 1991. So Warhammer Fantasy Battle's third edition, which was largely, regarded, or at least is regarded nowadays, as being one of the most time-consuming and stilted editions of the pre-Age of Sigmar fantasy battle game. It still dominated the market. There was a massive audience for it. Games Workshop had already built up quite a strong audience into their hobby as opposed to the wargaming hobby at large. And Fantasy Warlord, unfortunately, was pretty much panned by what wargaming media there was in 1990. And Fantasy Warlord stopped printing 18 months later, and by 1993, Folio Works ceased operations as a legally trading business. Fantasy Warlord was comprehensive, but it was also complicated, more so than even Warhammer Fantasy Battle's third edition. Firstly, it used 100-sided dice, or percentage die as we call them, instead of Games Workshop's tried and trusted buckets of 6-sided dice, or D6. And that's been emulated by most successful war games ever since. The idea that you can pretty much take dice out of any board game or traditional game that has dice. They're usually 6-sided dice, which means that you can use them for a game of Warhammer. Not so with Fantasy Warlord, because the late 80s and early 1990s, D100s and unusual polyhedral dice was still largely the province of RPG players, which didn't have the large cult following that it does these days. This is the one that makes me laugh. So sometimes we think that Warhammer Fantasy Battles was a bit complicated, but when you think about it in terms of its phases, you had movement, you had magic, you had shooting, you had close combat, and that would be at turnover. Everything could be resolved in those 4 phases of a turn. Then your opponent would have those 4 phases, and then you'd go on to the next turn. You could do 6 of those in about 2 hours, usually, given the size of your army. Maybe 3 hours if it was a bit bigger, or you were dealing with a slightly clunkier edition like 3rd edition Fantasy Battles. Fantasy Warlord had 11 phases. Yeah, 11 phases in a turn. And bear in mind, a lot of that was done simultaneously, so it wouldn't be a very lengthy I go, you go process. A lot of that would be simultaneous, and instead of having a dedicated magic phase, you can actually use magic at any point in those phases. So obviously you might have some movement related spells or some attack related spells, and you could use your magic abilities at any point during that turn. But that still meant that of all those 11 phases, not one of them was a magic phase. So if you think about it, realistically, there were kind of 12 phases in there. And also, the thing that I think is quite nice, and it shows how much they thought about it, but is also just endemic to the complications of the rule set, you have these green bits at the back, and the idea was that you would take these out and use them as your army reference. Now, what these were handouts with all the relevant percentages that your fantasy race would need to move, shoot, and fight, because they weren't included in the core rules. It was entirely dependent on what race you had. And so we're talking about their movement. You have your movement in centimetres here, depending on right down to what armour they're wearing. The penalties for changing formation, order and reaction tests, move and fire costs, firing modifiers, ranks for firing. Yeah, and all those sorts of things like that. And we're looking at the let's scroll down here. We're looking at the high elves here, and they even their hated foes at the top there, orcs and hobgoblins. And so those modifiers and those values would be different for every single faction. There was no common part of those rules where there would be certain dice values held in common or certain values in the mechanisms held in common. Everything was unique to each race, and so every single army required a double-sided A4 handout. However, looking at the wargames industry now, I must ask, was Fantasy Warlord merely ahead of its time? Looking through some of the mechanisms in Fantasy Warlord's rules, we see a lot that is popular in many wargame systems today. While D100 still seem a touch excessive, fantasy wargames like J.J. McCullough's Oathmark, which we have here, and Rick Priestley's Warlords of Erewhon, which I have here, have moved over to the increasingly popular 10-sided dice, or D10. And while brigades of 2 or more units and a leader are still very much the province of historical wargames, the popularisation of the system under Warlord Games' Black Powder and Pike and Shot and Hail Caesar show that the combined arms brigade system that we now see can be viable in an evening's game on a 6-foot by 4-foot table. Their system of unit activation, where you have to roll a dice to see if a unit carries out their orders, that's now standard fare in almost every popular wargame not made by Games Workshop. It's very difficult now to think of a wargame that isn't a Games Workshop game where you don't have to roll for activation to make one of your units move or shoot or fight in melee. It's such a common rule now, but back in 1990 that was revolutionary. Even their system of simultaneously giving orders to units and brigades is something that's increasingly common in mass battle wargames. We start to see that now, where the aim of the game is not to respond to your opponent's maneuvers, but to preempt them instead. And furthermore, in games like Oathmark and Mantic Games' Kings of War, I only have the Gamers edition of that, so I'm sorry it doesn't look as nice as the other ones. Their system of heroes and characters behave more like supporting specialist leaders, which was what Fantasy Warlord had. None of that Games Workshop fare of your hero is a one-man army who can destroy multiple regiments unaided. And as someone who came to wargaming, or came into the wargaming hobby when Warhammer Fantasy Battles 6th edition was in full swing, I find that Fantasy Warlord has the only comparable level of army customization to those old days of 6th edition, and the previous editions as well, which were incredibly customizable. If you can forgive, Fantasy Warlord had some very arbitrary limits on the amount of missile weapons that your army could have. I suppose that the idea of that was to try and stop people from forming gunline armies or from power gaming in ways that you used to see in Warhammer Fantasy Battles. So you'd have a rule, say for example in an orc army, you couldn't have more than 20% of your models armed with missile weapons, whereas in an elf army, I think it went up to about 35 or 40%. But in addition, Fantasy Warlord also has one of the largest and most comprehensive hero generation systems that I've ever seen. Very much more like RPG character creators like Dungeons and Dragons, which was obviously their inspiration. But then it also has an absolutely massive magic item collection. I think it's about 100 different magic items of varying shades just in one list. That you can take out for almost all of your characters. While Folio Works is dead and buried and Gary Chalk and Ian Bailey have abandoned the dream of competing with Games Workshop, I must say that Fantasy Warlord is a rough diamond, really, of a game, overflowing with so many good ideas, but they couldn't harmonise them with the Wargames community. They couldn't harmonise them with the smaller, more niche war games market of 1990. But I think now that in this current era, which we know and so many people know as the golden age of wargaming, many of the mechanisms that Fantasy Warlord had that weren't popular in 1990 are now very popular with the modern, much larger, much more connected wargaming community that exists, today. And perhaps now more than ever, Fantasy Warlord needs a second edition, streamlined perhaps and fine tuned to our current sensitivities, but I think that it's perfectly doable. I think that a second edition of Fantasy Warlord is completely feasible. And if I ever saw it happen, I must say I'd be a big fan and I'd be happy to chip in. And before we go, I just want to talk about really Fantasy Warlord and how a copy of Fantasy Warlord came into my possession. I must have been about 14, maybe 15, and I had a habit where we would go to, let me think, it was called Skirmish. That's right, Skirmish. It was a war game show in Bexley Heath in Kent. I'd go with my grandparents or my granddad. It was my trade off for going to toy fairs with him and model railway shows with him, as that we'd also go to war game shows when they came up. And it was one of the, I suppose you'd call it a bring and buy stall. It wasn't very big, it was just a couple of traders with their second hand items. And as you can see, this was marked up as £12, but it wasn't actually £12 for sale. Oh, let me move it down so you can see it. Yeah, so it says there £12, but it didn't cost me £12 to buy. That was actually the original retail price back in the early 90s, which was quite a lot of money back then. I think I picked that up for £5, I think. And I, as a young wargamer, just really starting to come out of the shadow of Games Workshop, I read this thing front to back multiple times. It was such an eye-opening experience for me because it was the first time that I'd properly experienced an expansive fantasy wargaming setting that hadn't been written by Games Workshop. This was really my first voyage, if you want to put it that way, away from the Warhammer world. And obviously I didn't know anybody who played the game, and if I'd known any more about it, then I would have known that nobody played this game. But it was really quite fundamental to me, and I was so taken in with the. I'll try and find some bits for you here because I still find this book so exciting, and it's such a shame the way that things went. So we've got the character creation here. So just the first one, warrior heroes. Let's see what you're seeing. So I can see my camera here. So you'd have a command factor where you'd roll a d6 and that would determine their command factor. Then a morale factor of d4 plus 1. Combat modifiers 10d10, 12d10. You could roll a percentage die and that would determine their experience level and skills. And then over here, skills and attributes where you'd roll a percentage die however many times, and everything from being a fast runner or a strong swimmer to having the ability to deflect missiles with your sword, which I just think is incredible. And that's just one of the characters. You have warrior heroes, priests, warrior priests, magic users, thieves, discipline masters as well, which were unique to orc, goblin, and hobgoblin armies. So you could again roll for their skills, and that was the same with every single character that you made. You had a divine intervention table to see if the gods would smile upon your efforts in the battle. Let's see, can you see that? There we go. Oh, keeps on going in and out of focus. That's a pity. There we go. And just, the level of detail in this game, man, was just absolutely astounding. And some of the colour pictures, the set battle pieces, are still just some of the loveliest pictures of a war game in action I think I have ever seen. And yeah, so you've got all the different kinds of magic here. So blade magic and the different kinds of magic items that you could get. And that's even before you get to army organisation. So the brigade, at least 2 units and a battlefield commander. So that's very much like in Black Powder, where you have at least 2 regiments and then you have a brigade commander. Except in this case, the brigade commander is, of course, let me move these away. The brigade commander is, of course, a wizard or a knight or a thief or something like that. Instead of just being kind of a roving diorama that gives morale buffs to your units. Instead, it's actually a support unit that has the ability to turn the tide of your brigade's fortunes. And let's see. Have different formations that you can have. This is one of the few. You can see I got this second hand from the quality of some of the pages here, but the Cantabrian Circle is a formation for your brigade. This was the first rulebook I'd seen where formation changes really meant something in a game. In Warhammer Fantasy Battles, everything moves around in squares and rectangles, and that's about it. But to see, the ability to use the hedgehog formation for your spears, or the Cantabrian Circle for your light cavalry, and things like that, was just incredible. You would start with you'd start the battle with a scouting phase, where you could use your flying beasts and your light cavalry to scout ahead. So the side that lost the scouting contest must provide his opponent with a sketch map of his planned deployment. This should list the positions of each troop type, units hidden in woods or buildings, or by the illusion cloak. They don't have to be revealed. But stating their race, but not their armor or morale class, what weapons they're armed with, except to say they are missile troops. No characters need to be marked on the map except for the general, whose position must be shown. And so there was so much in here. There was so many good ideas that just sadly none of it was particularly put together well enough to sell well in 1990. But you look at so many of these ideas that are here, and just I remember reading it again about, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, and just reading through the ways that armies were gathered together. I was thinking that's like Black Powder. And then I was reading about sort of how the combat worked and things like that, and I could see parallels with the likes of Oathmark and Kings of War, and you can really see what Chalk and Bailey were going for, or what I suppose, to use the proper name, Folio Works was going for. And it's just such a shame that it didn't come true. I mean, some of these pictures are just absolutely wonderful, aren't they? Oh, it's not. There we go. And then was that some sort of gathering together in the town square there? But no, some absolutely beautiful pictures and a beautiful game. And then the second part of the book is lore. They created an entire world, the world of Vortimax. And that was also just incredible. You had the, let me see, had the Scarlet Empire somewhere. I believe it was perhaps in the north. And then you had the, all these different trader states and the western and eastern orc and goblin forces. And they just, it was such an enthralling setting. And each race has their own gods, as you can see there. So Pegvash, the master smith, who is said to have created the dwarves from the bones of the world. And then you even go, let me see, Well, there's a breakdown of the human realms in the world of Vortimax. So yes, so you have the Scarlet Empire here. Then you have the smaller states like Loris, Pyrrhicard, Starkel, Corella. And then down here you have Sasania, Ostaria, the Saurian Empire. I think that there's just so much in here. It's such an enthralling setting. And then each of the different groups of the human states have their own gods. So you have the central kingdoms. Their gods aren't actually listed, but then you have the trader states, whose gods are listed. Put them up there. You have Klek, the god of good fortune and wealth, which is obviously the major god of the trader states. And so yes, there's lots of the human realms here. Then you have the mysterious eastern realms, the 9 realms of Kerakut, Akmar, Al-Wahat, Barmak, Gubar, Madras, Naragan, Shamard, Ashwan, and Zebaida. You know, there's so many interesting things here. Really, really are. The Scarlet Empire is sort of an analogue to the Chinese, and it's really, really quite interesting. There we go. I'll just read this for you. Let me see, let's bring that up so you can sort of see it. In recent years, because of the depredations of Eastern Orcs, some border provinces have been placed directly under the control of the Imperial Army, which has caused bitter resentment. However, this edict was only issued to try and curb the Orc incursions and because of the Yellow Fan Revolt, which was sparked off by the actions of Mad Emperor Feng Wu Feng. Feng Wu Feng believed he was the descendant of a magical tortoise and therefore had a special relationship with all reptiles. When an Orc alliance of clans known as the Lightning Horde invaded the northwest province of Lo Pang, instead of dispatching his imperial soldiers, Feng Wu Feng sent an army of caged lizards to relieve his hard-pressed people. Understandably, this action was not popular in Lo Pang and sparked off the Yellow Fan Revolt. I love little things like that. So it's not just a generic lore that they've come up with, but they come up with an entire setting with random stories like that, which has shaped the history of it. And you even, towards the end, you have the Witch King of the Dark Realm of Arnlaug. I suppose that's him. Scary fella. But yeah, so just to wrap this video up, guys, I absolutely love this rule set, and I think that now more than ever, there's an opportunity to perhaps see something of its like again. Because one thing to note as well is that Alternative Armies, the company responsible for the Flintlock games, and Slaughterloo, and that all the sort of games set in the world of Valen, actually had the rights to produce the miniature range for Fantasy Warlord, and they created a few blister packs of metal heroes and metal soldiers for the Scarlet Empire, for the elves and the dwarves and different heroes. And within the last couple of years, they've actually brought that miniature line back because there was a small cult following saying, actually, we really liked these. And so they still had access to the molds and to the the injection molds, and so they just thought, well, let's make a few more, and so now they still sell them at the Alternative Armies website, and I just think that it would be absolutely wonderful if we saw something the likes of Fantasy Warlord again. It's a sad story really, because when you try and start a project purely to spite your rivals, perhaps your former employers, you get more caught up on trying to get the once over on your rivals than you do actually creating something beautiful. And it's frustrating because in many ways Folio Works was so close. Gary Chalk and Ian Bailey almost created an absolutely incredible game that really could have rocked Games Workshop to its core. But there were just too many ideas put in there, probably not enough play testing, and this overwhelming sense of we have to defeat Games Workshop, and that I think was their primary goal more than creating a decent wargaming rule set. And that Red Giant magazine that I mentioned petered out after only 2 issues, which is another great shame. So yeah, the Folio Works company only lasted for 3 years. Only a few thousand copies of Fantasy Warlord were sold. Uh, Red Giant, I don't think you can really find any copies of that these days. But that's the story of Fantasy Warlord, the sad story of Fantasy Warlord and Folio Works. But hopefully, there might be something a little bit more hopeful and bright around the horizon. And maybe we'll see the likes of Fantasy Warlord Second Edition someday. Who knows? It's a pleasant thought, isn't it? Anyway, this has been Imaginary Conflicts. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Good night, God bless, and I will see you soon. Cheers!